Welcome, museum members and donors. I'm Kara Huang, the Senior Director of Individual and Major Giving at the Fine Arts Museum San Francisco, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's Curator Conversation on our upcoming exhibition, Last Supper in Pompeii, From the Table to the Grave. Today, we'll be joined by Renée Dreyfus, the Distinguished Curator and Curator in charge of Ancient Art and Interpretation at the Fine Arts Museum San Francisco. Renée received her BA in Philosophy from Boston University, her MA in Ancient Mediterranean Studies from Brandeis University, and her PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. She specializes in ancient Mediterranean art and archaeology with a keen interest in Near Eastern art and its interconnections with the Egyptian and classical worlds. She is particularly focused on the spread of iconography and artistic forms throughout these cultures. Renée has taught classes in ancient art, archaeology, mythology, and the interrelationship of art, literature, and philosophy in ancient times. She possesses a unique perspective on the cultural heritage and artistic development in the ancient Near East. We're delighted to speak with her today and learn about the upcoming exhibition, Last Supper in Pompeii. Following Renée's presentation, we'll be joined by Roman food historian and experimental archaeologist, Sally Grainger. Sally began her career as a hands-on pastry chef, and after a decade working as a chef, she took up classical studies as an undergraduate at Royal Holloway College. In 1996, she and Andrew Dalby wrote the Classical Cookbook, which was an enduring success. The recipes, as authentic as could be achieved, were Grainger's. Meanwhile, having taken her degree in 1993, Grainger began a new career in Reconstruction archaeology and food writing fed by continuing research. Grainger and her partner, Chris Brocock, a medieval Latinist, have produced what is now the standard bilingual edition of Apicius, the Roman cookbook, and the practical companion, Cooking Apicius, Roman Recipes for Today. Later in the program, Sally will recreate an authentic toasted pine kernel satay sauce recipe from her cookbook, Cooking Apicius, Roman Recipes for Today. The recipe to accompany her cooking demonstration has been shared prior to today's discussion and also available to view on our website. For more ancient Roman recipes, visit the DeYoung and Legion of Honor Museum stores at shop.famsf.org to purchase Sally's cookbooks, Cooking Apicius, Roman Recipes for Today, and the Classical Cookbook. So, before we start the program, we would like to give a special thank you to those who made this exhibition, Last Supper in Pompeii, From the Table to the Grave, possible. This exhibition is conceived and developed by the Ashmolean Museum, University of Oxford, and is organized by the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco in collaboration with the Museo Archeologico Nazionale di Napoli and the Parco Archeologico di Pompeii. I would like to thank presenting sponsors, John A. and Cynthia Fry-Gunn, Claire C. McAvoy, Charitable Remainder Unit Trust, and J.D. McAvoy Trust, and Diane B. Wilsey. Significant support is provided by the Ruddock Foundation for the Arts. Generous support is provided by Iris Chan and Dr. Michael Chan. Additional support is provided by Bernard and Jane von Bothmer in honor of Dr. Dietrich von Bothmer, Elizabeth D. Moyer, PhD, and Michael C. Pawanda, PhD, Sheila Wilczek, and the Ancient Art Council of the Fine Arts Museum, San Francisco. So with that, I turn it over to Renée, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Karen. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm looking forward to the exhibition being on view and being able to take people through it. But right now, what I really like to do is show you some of the high points of this really fascinating and unique exhibition, Last Supper in Pompeii, From the Table to the Grave. On the morning of October 17th in AD 79, a catastrophic eruption of the long dormant Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii and the surrounding area under a rain of ash, pumice, and volcanic mud. The volcano released massive amounts of energy in a gigantic cloud, spewing stones and then collapsing in pyroclastic surges. The fast-moving, lethal, superheated avalanches of toxic gas and ash that burned everything in its path. Day turned into night, pitch black skies finally cleared to reveal utter devastation. And you can see this in this reproduction of what it must have looked like. And this will be in a video that we'll be showing in the exhibition. But you can see how drastic this eruption was. By the evening, Pompeii was gone, buried under tons of solidified volcanic matter and thick ash. Thousands had died, agriculture ceased, and a once thriving economy was destroyed. The powerful eruption of Vesuvius seems to have come as a surprise, although now we know that an earthquake that took place 17 years earlier in AD 62, and even more recent rumblings were warnings that after hundreds of years of dormancy, Vesuvius was waking up. And here you see another example of Vesuvius waking up. This photograph was taken in 1944 when there was a massive eruption of the mountain. Pliny the Younger wrote an eyewitness account of the eruption from across the Bay of Naples. And he wrote, "Buildings were now shaking with violent shocks, darkness blacker and denser than any night, and the sea receded from the shore so that quantities of sea creatures were left stranded on dry sand as flames burst from the volcanic cloud." Pompeii had been a bustling city situated near the Bay of Naples and nestled in the shadow of Vesuvius. In what is now perhaps the best known volcanic eruption of all time, the city's beautiful estates, surrounding farmland and nearby villages were suddenly buried under pumice and ash by the dramatic eruption. Recent studies of the human remains show that those who perished in the eruption were well-nourished and healthy. The remains of those whose last meals were eaten on that day provided a wealth of information about their health, diet, and lifestyles. Last Supper in Pompeii tells the story of how before the eruption, these people were engaged in typical daily activities, many of which revolved around food and drink. It also shows how digging around in rubble, from the food plates to the scraps found in kitchen drains and latrines. And by the way, a surprisingly good source of information about food was discovered in the kitchen drains and in the latrines. And they offer us a good understanding of how people lived millennia ago. And what you're looking at is a kitchen in Pompeii. This exhibition, with its focus on the love of food and drink in Pompeii, illustrates the Roman passion for the culinary arts and fine wine. In fact, Pompeii's unique condition, as if frozen in time, creates the most important portal to the ancient Roman world. This exhibition, which had its start at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, has been adapted for an American audience, and it includes some well-known works of art and others used by slaves in kitchens like this. The majority of the rare antiquities come from the Pompeii Archaeological Park and the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. And we're grateful to them and to the Ashmolean and Getty Museums and the Wyvern Collection for their loans. So the objects run the gamut from luxury furnishings and tableware of precious metal, mosaics, frescoes, and marble and bronze sculpture that decorated the homes of the prosperous in Pompeii, to carbonized foodstuffs. Most of these objects have never been exhibited in the United States before, and we're just delighted to be able to present them. We begin the exhibition with a statue of Bacchus, who is known as Dionysus to the Greeks, and he was the Roman god of wine and fertility, and was one of the most celebrated deities in Pompeii. In this beautiful marble statue, he appears as a young and a virile god with wine grapes cascading down each side of his headdress. He holds a wine cup in one hand and his sacred staff, the thyrsus, in his other. His trusty companion, a panther, is by his side. We start the show with him because Bacchus was considered the lord of the banquet, and along with other gods worshipped in Pompeii, he was central to every aspect of food and drink in Roman life. Only by gaining the support of the gods through prayers and offerings could any food be produced, sold, or consumed. And what we're looking at now is one of the beautiful frescoes that will be in the exhibition. And it's to show us how the interiors of many Pompeian houses were lavishly decorated, with walls covered with colorful frescoes. The Romans loved gardens and natural spaces and brought actual gardens and plants, as well as depictions of them, into their homes. This is a beautiful example of a painted garden scene that was discovered in the 1960s in the House of the Golden Bracelet. This sumptuous dwelling was a palatial residence on the western edge of Pompeii. It was laid out over 3 floors to accommodate a sloping landscape and also the city wall. On the lowest level were the garden and 2 rooms, including one room that held these frescoes, which was a summer dining room. One of the sides of this room was open to a view of the sea. And I have to say, looking closely at this fresco, it reveals the Roman ability to observe and depict nature in all great detail. And putting it in this room with this open scene, looking out over into the sea, it was as if to enlarge the actual adjacent garden. And so the summer dining room was painted to resemble a pavilion looking out onto a luxurious and elegantly appointed garden filled with birds. And the plants were layered to give a sense of depth. Among them are bay trees, strawberry trees, cypresses, viburnum, and yellow daisies. And the birds are equally exceptionally detailed and therefore identifiable, including a song thrush, doves, a blackbird, and a golden oriole. One can imagine the fresh evening breezes wafting into this dining room from the garden while the diners enjoyed their banquet. In this painting of a dining room, you see men and women depicted as reclining together on couches as slaves served them. Like a speech bubble in a comic strip, one guest says the Latin words. In translation, I'll read them. "Get yourselves comfortable, I'm going to sing." And another, lying on the adjacent couch, said, "Yes, you go for it." So dining was about being social, having a good time. The Latin word for a banquet or dinner party was convivium. Convivium literally meaning a living or being together. A dining party assembled people for fine food and wine, and by the way, lots of it, amid luxurious surroundings to enhance the experience. And you can see on the three-legged table, there are wonderful serving dishes that are put there for the guests, but also to show the host's wealth, good taste, and power. So everything around the dining projected the host's luxurious power. That means his frescoes, mosaics, sculpture, and the silver he showed off. And of course, by the quality of the food and the rare wines he served. In Roman society, as with the early Etruscans, men and women shared the same couches, something unthinkable in Greek society. The exhibition also describes areas in a Roman house which were especially important to food and drink, including the airless, smoky, and smelly kitchens. A part of the house that is rarely touched upon in other Roman exhibitions. And carved stone tables like this were often placed in an area called the atrium, a large room at the entrance to a wealthy Pompeian home, which, with its imposing size and impressive architecture and decor, expressed the owner's power and influence. The most elegant type of marble table was the Greek monopodium, with its single sculpted support, and that's what you see here. And the Romans had an abiding taste for Greek culture and collected art in the Greek style. And here is a very good example of a table that was originally a Greek design, now used in a Roman home. This lovely example depicts Bacchus as a baby, cradled in the arms of Silenus, his guardian. Statues of bronze or the family dining silverware were prominently displayed on these tables. And here is a wonderful example in the exhibition, and it shows the type of silver that was flaunted in an atrium. It's an intricately worked dish showing the sacrifice of the Greek princess Iphigenia by her father, King Agamemnon, at the start of the Trojan War. So this exhibition includes many fine examples of these beautiful works in precious metal. We move on to show how the gods were everywhere in Pompeii, and the devotion to them was shown by daily sacrifices at their domestic shrines, known as lorarium, named after the small statuettes of the noble ancestors and household deities called lares. The master of the household, as spiritual head of the family, led the family in sacrifices at the shrine. He lit lamps, and on a small altar, he burned incense and offered food and drink. These offerings included milk, wine, fruit, eggs, pine cones, and for special occasions, a blood sacrifice of a rooster or even a piglet. In this lararium, and it's from a kitchen wall, the master in the center at the top, you can see him standing next to the image of an altar in the center above. He is making an offering of wine or honey. And he has pulled his toga over his head and carries a horn of plenty. He represents prosperity and security and is the genius, the spirit and life force of the home. It's wonderful to have images that show things exactly how this type of ritual took place. The next fresco shows Bacchus and looks like Mount Vesuvius. The area around Mount Vesuvius was famous for grape growing and winemaking, and Pompeii sat in the heart of this wine country. So this wall painting from a domestic shrine in the slave quarters of a large house shows Bacchus. And you see him off on the left-hand side with his pet panther, and he's pouring some wine for the ready lips of the panther. And his gift of wine was so important to this area that his body has been turned into a bunch of grapes. He is standing by what appears to be a stylized view of Vesuvius. Its lower slopes covered in vine trellises of a squared pergola style, similar to those discovered in the Roman vineyards excavated near Pompeii. Wine was central to the economy, therefore, and many local estates were almost exclusively wine producers. The surge of gas and ash that poured down from the slopes of Vesuvius were superheated to temperatures up to between 550 and 750 degrees Fahrenheit, preserving examples of fresh and dried foodstuffs by reducing them to charcoal. And you see this here in the carbonized bread, which is a really good example of the type of bread that was actually found in the ovens of Pompeii and left during the eruption. Excavations of shops have uncovered bulk quantities of wheat, spelt, barley, and millet, vegetables including beans and lentils, and fresh and dried fruit including figs, dates, and pomegranates. In private homes, food has been found in jars, in cooking pots, and even left on plates on a table in the rush to escape the catastrophe. The foods in domestic settings include onions, olives, lentils, beans, plums, grapes, nuts, and even bread like this with pieces of goat cheese. Although some goods were imported, most food was produced locally, thanks to Pompeii's mild climate and fertile soil. And of course, food was also gathered from the bountiful sea. And from the Bay of Naples come mussels, oysters, sea urchins, as well as snails. And I love, love, love this amazing mosaic because it's overflowing with sea creatures. You see squid and eel and various types of fish which whirl around an octopus that is locked in mortal combat with a lobster. This mosaic is an emblema, the centerpiece of a larger mosaic floor. And this part is constructed of very, very small mosaic tiles that were used to show fine details of color and texture. If you look really carefully, and in the exhibition you'll be able to see this very well, every fish scale is highlighted and each species is identifiable. Again, we're looking at the Roman ability to depict nature and create images of identifiable species of plants, animals, fish. Such panels as this were extremely expensive and proclaim this family's wealth and good taste. Well, looking at this mosaic, you'll see a man is handing out bread of the kind we were just looking at. And shops and bars were essential to the life of Pompeii. They even had fast food restaurants. But food and drink were also distributed. In other ways. Temporary stalls sprung up at festivals and on holidays. At first glance, this fresco appears to show commercial activity in the Forum at Pompeii. A baker seems to be selling typically shaped loaves of bread to two men and a boy from a stall made of wooden planks, all painted in this fresco in marvelous detail. However, the man in the stall is well dressed, revealing that he is not, in fact, selling the bread, but giving it away. And he's giving it away in a carefully timed act of generosity just before the election of town officials. Now, in this fresco, you see a cockerel eating a pomegranate. And the Romans loved to depict food in their art. Here, for example, in this charming fresco, you see the rooster, and he's enjoying the seeds from the open piece of a pomegranate. However delightful this very colorful and beautiful fresco might look, a favorite conceit of the Romans was to show a live animal eating what it would be cooked with. In this case, what we're looking at is a cockerel who might have been stuffed with pomegranate or perhaps covered in a pomegranate sauce. In this unique scene for Roman frescoes, it shows food preparation. It's very, very rare to see something like this, where we're actually looking at butchers. And once again, how delightful this image is. Here are two bare-footed men, surely slaves, wearing short, sleeveless, striped tunics. And they're cutting the carcass of a small, cloven-hooved animal, perhaps a veal calf. The man on the right holds the feet of the animal, while the figure on the left slices into the belly with a wood-handled knife with a triangular blade, a typical instrument used by Roman butchers. Well, Bacchus, as the god of wine, was also the god of drunken excess. And his followers, including the half-human, half-animal male satyrs, and the female maenads with their ritual and revelry, often depicted in passionate encounters. Images of them cavorting, as well as other naughty subjects, form a special part of our exhibition, coming primarily from the secret cabinet of the National Museum of Archaeology in Naples. These lively and lascivious scenes tell of the importance of fertility in the worship of Bacchus, as well as the good times the Romans, wealthy and elite, enjoyed. In this fresco, a satyr is drinking from a rhyton. It's a drinking horn that once you pour the liquid into the top opening, you had to be prepared to drink as it flowed out of the hole at the bottom. And you can see how the satyr has aimed that tip just to the point where it could enter, the wine could enter right into his mouth. The Roman world was more comfortable with some aspects of sexuality, such as nakedness, than we might be. Therefore, it's not surprising that Pompeii was rich in erotica, with statues, frescoes, mosaics, and household items decorated with explicit imagery. And here you see two lovers lying on the same couch at their banquet. The man is holding a rhyton in his right hand, getting ready to aim it towards his mouth. A woman is calling out to her slave for more food and drink to come. And again, on that three-legged table, you see silver, beautiful examples of the household silver that show off the importance and power of the owner. Some of the images you will see in the exhibition were not solely sexual. They were also thought to provide prosperity, good luck, and protection from evil spirits. You have a more permissive attitude towards sex, and it's evidenced by these erotic works of art that were not only found in brothels and public baths in Pompeii, but also in private homes. Therefore, it's not surprising that Pompeii was rich in this erotica. And to keep my talk from having a PG-18 rating, I will restrain from some of the more explicit imagery at this time. But just to say that images of oversized phalluses are found throughout Pompeii as good luck charms and also symbols of fruitfulness. And for that reason, artists incorporated such imagery into everything from furniture to oil lamps and whimsical wind chimes, as well as doorbells placed in the entrances of houses and shops. Well, believe it or not, this mosaic panel once decorated the center of a dining room floor. Amidst the jollity and the laughter of the invited guests, the Romans were aware of a less welcome guest, death. The grinning skeleton, in the guise of a serving slave, holds a wine jug in each hand, ready to pour some of the precious contents for us. To our eyes, this choice of decoration may seem odd, but to the Romans, This image was entirely appropriate and might have been the subject of lively discussion at the feast. The two worlds of death and the banquet, the grave and the table, were never far apart. The skeleton is death himself, and the message is very clear. Carpe diem. Seize the day. Enjoy the delights of the banquet while you can. Many wine estates were situated around Pompeii, but Villaby in the small town of Oplantis, a mile and a quarter west of Pompeii, was truly unique. When discovered, the villa contained over 1,200 local wine amphora, huge quantities of pomegranates, and weights for measuring bulk produce. It appears to have been a depot for processing and distributing goods from the area's many farms. The villa's central courtyard had a tall two-story colonnade, and the complex included fine apartments, shops, and storerooms that overlooked the sea. In one of these rooms, more than 60 victims of the eruption were discovered. They were divided into two groups: the owners and their family, carrying jewelry and coins, and the slaves, who had no possessions with them at all. This room became a tomb. This room became a tomb for this group, who, in their attempt to flee from the devastating fury of Vesuvius, had sought refuge inside. Rich and poor, they met their terrible fate together. Archaeologists made casts of some of these victims by pouring plaster into voids in the hardened ash left by the bodies. One skeleton was cast using transparent resin rather than plaster. The remains of this woman were first cast in wax, which was covered by plaster. Once the plaster had set, the wax was melted and replaced with the epoxy resin. This transparent cast shows her bones, skull, and teeth, as well as the possessions she carried, from gold jewelry to a string of inexpensive beads. We end our exhibition with this cast. Known as the Lady of Oplantis, this woman was in her 30s, and apart from dental problems, was in good health when she perished. The position of her body, as you can see here, with her arms raised like that, and her contorted form, reveals she succumbed to thermal shock, as that extreme temperature caused a sudden contraction of her muscles. Her unique cast allows us to present an actual witness to the terrible events of AD 79. This is not a plaster cast. This is the actual cast made of epoxy of this woman. And when the Lady of Oplantis was discovered, she had near her a bronze jug, perhaps for water in those last terrifying hours. She also carried a purse, a small basket containing coins and jewelry. Some of her possessions are in the exhibition, including the jug, a Greek-style snake ring, and a small gemstone engraved with a bird on a branch. Her gold armlet was cut from the cast and replaced with a replica. conclusion, thousands of people who lived in and around Pompeii met an unexpected and horrible death in AD 79. Young and old, masters and slaves, merchants, landlords, shopkeepers, and their customers all died in the cataclysmic eruption. With my gratitude, I'm going to leave it to Paul Roberts, who organized the Ashmolean version of this unique exhibition, to get the final word. And I quote him, "For the victims of this human tragedy, there were no funerary feasts, no mourning, no prayers with incense and offerings of wine, fruit, or animals. They had no tombstone to carry their name and image to future generations. We alone are left to imagine on their behalf the afterlife they wished for, a banquet with beautiful furnishings, fine decor, and beloved company, and dining and drinking into eternity." Thank you.
Hello there, welcome. Welcome to my Roman kitchen. My name is Sally Grainger and I'm going to show you a few of my favourite Roman recipes. We're going to cook them on my own personal Roman kitchen, which my husband built for me in the garden. As you can see, it has an oven attached to a raised platform. It's basically a hearth at a nice easy height so you don't have to bend over. Basically it's charcoal, but it's also embers that come out of the oven that are used. So we're going to start with a Roman sauce. It's a roasted pine kernel sauce. Tastes a little bit like a satay sauce. Really spicy, sweet and sour. One of my favourites. And we're going to serve it with, it should be wild boar, but sadly I couldn't get any wild boar, so we've got a little bit of pork steak instead. So I've got a little bit of preparation to do. We're going to warm some wine on the charcoal and we're going to add a little bit of saffron to it. And as it warms, it'll take on that colour. Now the recipe actually says safflower, which is a cheaper and more readily available form of colouring, but we don't have that. We have proper saffron, so we're going to go with a luxurious version. So we dibble a bit of saffron in the wine and leave it to infuse. We're also going to be using lots of spices, and spices are ground in a special kind of mortar called a Roman mortaria. And as you can see, it has lots of grits on the inside, and these grits are brilliant for grinding nuts, for grinding seeds, for grinding fruit. But there's also lots of different kinds of Roman mortaria. This is a mortaria. This is much more natural and more familiar to us, and it's completely smooth. So it depends on what kind of sauce you're making as to which one you use. What they also always have is a lip, so you can hold on to it. So we start always with a Roman sauce with pepper. Pepper does not need to be roasted. Most seeds do. So we're going to put a little pan on the stove to warm up, and we start with pepper. Pepper's very expensive, or at least relatively expensive, so not the most poorest people couldn't access it, but most people wanted to. They aspired to it, shall we say. And we're going to put about 10 peppercorns in because we really do like the flavour of pepper. And we're going to break them open. So you pound them until they open into little chunks. And the next seed that we're going to use is cumin, and I need to roast it to bring out its flavour. And we want a couple of teaspoons of cumin, and we also want celery seed. And these both need roasting together. We'll have 1 teaspoon of celery, 2 of cumin, and we leave those two. Once they start to pop, you can do this at home with a dry pan on a gas cooker or wherever you're doing it. And you have to be careful to watch it. As soon as they start to pop, you lift it off. And we're going to add some herbs too. So all these herbs and spices will go in together, and And the spices will help the herbs to be ground, and the grits will help everything to be ground. So in here I have some fresh thyme from my garden, and we're just going to split those, pull the leaves off while we're waiting for the herbs, for the seeds to pop. And we've got fresh mint as well. If you're using dried thyme, it needs to be, you need to use a little less because it's very strong. So every so often you have a little grind, just now because the herbs are fresh, they've already broken down into pieces, just using the pepper. Now my wine is already simmering, it's gotten quite hot. I think I might lift it off soon. Hot enough, we'll put them in and we keep on grinding. It's rather labour intensive way of making any sauce, but take it in slow stages. And the next thing we need is our pine kernels, and we need to roast them. So we put our pan back on, and they need to be toasted brown but not burnt. It's very easy to burn pine kernels unless you're always on the case with them. So I have a very fine powder, as you can see. So my next herb is mint. This is fresh from the garden. And basically you just pull it apart and drop it in. And this is where I think these mortars become very special, because it doesn't take long for it to disappear. And all the little stalks in the centre have gone. What tends to happen at this point, and even more so when the nuts go in, is that everything sticks to the bottom and it looks as if you'll never get it off your mortaria. But when the liquids go in, they become, it all loosens it and it all floats to the surface. So now we wait for our pine kernels to take on colour, and they already do so. There's a little bit of colour in there. So we have to wait now, a little pause, until the next stage. Okay, we're ready for the next stage. My pine kernels are lovely and toasty, but not dark, because they alter the colour and texture of the sauce if they take on too much colour. But they're beautifully roasted, and the smell is beautiful. And so, this is when it becomes a little more hard work. But there's a lot of oil in a pine kernel, and when you want to actually pound them until that oil starts to come out and it forms a binding agent for the entire sauce, and it also thickens it. Oh, the smell is fabulous. It's a long time since I've made this sauce, and it's such a lovely smell. It's such a familiar smell. I used to make it so often when I worked at English heritage sites all over the country in Britain. It's the kind of sauce that you could easily make and do a presentation for the public and offer them a tasting. So I probably did it every weekend, all the time I was working for English heritage. And the smell is just so familiar. It's lovely, very nostalgic. So every piece of pine kernel, every piece of pine kernel has to become a paste. You don't want any lumps. Now we're almost at the stage when I can cook the meat. So I think I'm going to add my frying pan. Now this is rather a wonderful piece of kit. This is a Roman frying pan with a handle that folds away, and it was actually found in the grave of a soldier in Kellyan. So it's actually a piece of military frying pan, and it's the kind of frying pan that a soldier would have made his meat ration go a bit further. He would have made sauce to go with it, because it has the pouring lip at the end. Not a very efficient one, mind you, it always spills, but it's still a pouring lip. And we will add some oil to the pan. The other issue, of course, with it is it never sits flat because of its design, but then we'll have to live with that too. little bit of oil. There's quite a lot of fat in the pork, so we won't need too much. And we'll leave that to get a little hot. Cooking outdoors means that when the wind gets up, the ash flies around. You just have to live with it, really. So that's beginning to sizzle. Let's put that on. Yeah. So we want a nice sizzling. I think I might attempt to make a frying pan more level. There we go. You have to improvise. So we finish our grinding, and then we add all the liquids. Quite a lot of liquids in these sauces, not simply wine. Of course, there always is wine. We start with honey. Roman sauces are sweet and sour. The Romans loved honey. There isn't many recipes in the collection that doesn't have honey in, but you always balance it with vinegar. So I'm going to put it's a tablespoon in my recipe in the book. So these are very small spoons, so we'll add 2 of those. And then we need to balance it with vinegar. And we need to remember which is the vinegar. There we are. And so let's say an equal quantity by volume, because that's quite thick. So let's say 1, 2 of vinegar, just to balance the sweet and sour. And then we give it a stir. And we begin to loosen everything. The paste comes off. And all those green herbs have loosened and come off. There's nothing stuck at all. And then we add a little olive oil to loosen it. And we add that special ingredient that everybody fears, Roman fish sauce. It's called liquamen or garum, depending on whether you were Greek or Roman. And made simply with small whole fish, like an anchovy, sardine, sometimes mackerel. And these fish were salted whole. So basically you take it straight out of the sea, you add salt at a ratio of about 7 to 1 by volume, and you leave it in a vessel open to the sun. You stir it occasionally, the fish dissolves, the salt preserves the fish at the same time, a liquid comes out, and over time that liquid matures and takes on the flavour of the fish, and it gives us umami. And I'm sure you've heard of umami. It's that wonderful essence of deliciousness that you need in all food, but it's particularly good when found in things like anchovy and fermented anchovy particularly. So it is not something to be worried about. My fish sauce is called Red Boat, one of the finest fish sauces in the world, made in fact for the American market. It's exceptionally good. It has very high levels of protein, and it's certainly worth a try. In any kind of food, really. I use fish sauce in many different kinds of cooking. I hide it sometimes. I don't tell people because they're not so keen if they know. But it works. It gives you umami. It boosts the flavour of the food. So we're not going to use a lot. You can't use the honey spoon, so I will use this one. We're just going to add a tiny bit. That's about a dessert spoon, I would say. Oh, that funky smell. Beautiful. So now we loosen the sauce even more with our saffron flavoured wine, just to make it. And that's got a lot of colour, which is lovely. It should tone down the greenness and give it more of a yellow tinge, which is lovely, which is what I wanted. It needs to have a yellow tinge and not a green tinge. If it's got a green tinge, it's got too many herbs in it, so it's a balance. Now we can scrape it down and take out our pestle because we don't need it anymore. Many people question whether or not I should use a wooden pestle, where many pestles have been found to be stone, but I think it depends entirely on the ceramic in question. You've got quite a fragile ceramic, you really need to use wood. It's very effective, but a mortar like this, you would be much more successful using a stone. A small pebble from the beach is great. So, if we are certain our pork is cooked, and we're not quite certain yet, it's a very good fire, but let's give it a little bit more. You might stab it, see what we have inside. Now you see we're still pink, so that needs to be a little pause while we finish the meat, and then we can dish up and have a little taste. I like the fat to be crisp. Not always easy when you're frying, but you can hold it up into the fat, it's good. Right. That's a lot better. Okay. I'm going to put it in here. Right. So at the last stage, what I'm going to do is pour my sauce in to the pan and heat the sauce and finish the meat together as one. But it could thicken very quickly and I end up without a sauce, so I've still got my extra bit of wine here just in case. All those meat juices need to go into the sauce, so you just add it to the pan. And that's when these wonderful little spouts come in very useful. Sometimes very, very efficient ones, deep ones with a useful means of pouring quite thick sauces. And alternatively, I find this very strange, tiny little spout. Hard to believe that anything came out of there. It was just there for form, almost to demonstrate that it was a mortar. So I think smelling good. So we pour our green sauce. All those lovely juices, all those gorgeous brown juices are very necessary. That's natural umami, which you need to add to your so you see how rapidly it's evaporating. So I will almost certainly need more wine straight away. It's because that fire is so fierce, and it'll give me more of a yellow colour as well, which is what we like. I think we are there. We can dish up. Now, one of the special things about Roman food, it's important to bear in mind always that people don't eat with knives and forks. They didn't have forks. They used knives occasionally, but on the whole, meat was served so that it could be eaten with the fingers, which means that when the cook prepares a dish like this, it sits for a while before it goes out, because they wouldn't be able to pick it up. And it's also cut up, and it's cut up into pieces, finger pieces, so that each of the guests can take a small amount. And also the dish goes round the dining couch. And so people will take a small piece and they pass the bowl on. It's a beautiful poem that describes this process, and it talks about how some people don't want to let the bowl go forward and are also eager to get the bowl to come to them, and so they kind of are impatient both ways. And how annoying it is and how uncivilized it is to be impatient about when the bowl is coming to you. And civilized behavior is to always wait, be patient, and to take what is your due, and let the plate of food move forward to the next person. So we're going to cut this up into small pieces, and then I'm going to try it, so I'm looking forward to trying it. Lots of evidence for very elaborate napkins, clearly very essential if you're going to be eating with your fingers, so that you can clean yourself up between dipping your fingers in sauce. And here is our roasted pine kernel sauce with pork, made for sharing. Dip in.
In the Roman way.
The chef.
Well done, sir.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, Sally and Renee, for that wonderful presentation and your time, and for joining us for this Q&A. I'm excited. We have so many great questions, so let's get started. Renee, I'll start off with you. There's several questions about the fresco from the Lararium with the women and men lounging. People had questions about what the snakes symbolized, and why would the fresco be in the slave quarters?
Well, you've asked a lot of good questions, and let me just start with the snakes, because that in our culture tends to be an ominous symbol. We think of snakes from the Garden of Eden and other snakes that kind of have a sinister effect. But in this case, the snakes were symbols of care. They brought the family abundance, they brought good fortune to the family, wealth, and so they were respected, and there were offerings left for the snakes as well. And the question about why would a lararium be placed in a kitchen? And that is because the entire family, including slaves, which were considered part of the family, would have been there to worship. Worshiping the gods was a really important thing throughout, from the morning till night. It was an important aspect of the Roman world, and the gods were important for everything. And then I think your other question was about women reclining with men at a banquet. Was that was another question you asked?
Oh, no, no, that was, you answered both questions. And one other question related to that fresco was they thought the representation of the slave was so much smaller than the figures of the others. Is that a style that's common back then?
That's a really good observation. Yes, slaves were lesser. I mean, some of them could be children, and so therefore they were smaller. But in the cases where we have the frescoes showing the slaves, oftentimes they are put on a smaller scale. That doesn't mean that slaves weren't important to the family, or even that freed slaves couldn't be important to the community, and in fact they did. Slaves, it was a mobile kind of status, and slaves could be freed and become important to the society in Pompeii and during the Roman period in general.
Thanks for that, Renee. And I'll jump to Sally, because we can't have a show and demonstration about cooking without wine. Can you share a little bit about the grape varieties grown around Pompeii in Roman times? Are they still present today and still widely used, cultivated
Yes,
and
they
used?
are. Yes, they are. There's a particular grape variety called Falangina that I use quite a lot when I'm cooking. It's grown on the slopes of Vesuvius today. It's an ordinary wine. It's a vin de table. It's not considered to be exclusive, and it didn't used to travel out of Italy. They kept it for themselves, but it's beautiful for cooking. So I recommend Falangina. And the other particularly well-known great bottle of wine is called Lacrimae Christi, the Tears of Christ. And this is made, it's red wine, and it's made with a grape variety that was known to be grown on the slopes of Vesuvius in Roman times. And it's an exceptionally fine wine.
Fantastic, fantastic. The questions are just rolling in. And as a follow-up for Sally, we have a member who's curious about the frequency of the use of wheat, barley, or rye, gluten-bearing grains in the ancient world. So she noticed that you didn't use them as an ingredient.
No, lots of bread, of course. Bread was the staple for most people. Barley was the staple more so, I think, in Greece than it was in Rome. So most people would have a large piece of bread as their staple, and they would have what's called a pormentaria to go with it, something to go with your bread. It could be cheese, it could be smoked meat, and if you are wealthy, it could be a roasted pine kernel sauce with your pork. But the staple, the thing you actually fill up with, is always going to be bread.
And Sally, one thing we didn't really address is that dormouse was a delicacy for the Roman times. Can you talk a little about is that still very popular with the region now?
It's a very difficult issue now. There are two types of dormouse. There's the tiny little cute one that we always see in Alice of Wonderland in the teapot. And that is what people imagine that the Romans consumed, but it's not. It's a completely different species, the edible dormouse, and it's basically a large furry-tailed rat. And it was bred for the table. Wow. And they used to fatten them up in these wonderful ceramic containers that had a kind of a run around it, and you used to feed it with honey and bread and fruit and things, wonderful things to make it really sweet and fattened. And they used to swell in size, and in the same way as they would have as they're preparing for hibernation. That's the point. They get very much fatter. They can put on as much as 50% of body weight.
Wow.
That's when they become desirable. We are told that running a dormouse farm was very profitable because, of course, they're bred quite prolifically, and you didn't need a great deal of land in order to have these dormice for sale. And there's only one recipe that survives in Apicius, and it's stuffed, and it's stuffed with pork meat as well as other dormouse meat, and pine kernels are in there. Pine kernels are very common in Roman recipes. Quite expensive today, to be honest, to keep replicating the recipes.
Wonderful.
Somebody asked me, if I could interrupt, somebody asked me about a food processor on the list. I wanted to say, yes, you can use a food processor for these recipes. The texture's not quite the same. And so if you have an ordinary modern mortar, you can try with that. But yes, I often, I have to say, use a food processor when I'm making a lot of sauce, because otherwise it gets quite exhausting, as you can imagine.
Yes, thank you, Sally. Renee, one interesting question, and also that imagery of the skeleton of Mosaic is, of course, stunning and also surprising to find there. A question was, do you think that could have been a way to say drink with moderation? Essentially, so could that have been another way to read that?
Well, you have to be at a Roman banquet to know that moderation was not any of their, not in their mind at all. And,
not in the vocabulary.
No, even a vomitorium, if you can imagine, might be considered useful so that you could come back and drink some more and eat some more. What's so amazing about about the image of the skeleton is that it does show how wine was served. It's the skeleton as a servant, and it has two ascoi, drinking, pouring vessels, one in each hand. And they're made out of ceramic, but they're supposed to represent a wineskin. And in fact, this seems to be the way wine would have been served, with the two-handed way, so that you could pour as much wine as necessary in a short amount of time as it was consumed during the dinner.
Wonderful. I know we're running out of time, so I'll go with a couple more questions. One of the first questions to me was, how open were the Romans over time to the cuisine of conquered cultures as the ones to the gods or of some of the cultures?
If I could answer that, I think in relation to Rome, its cuisine is Greek in origin. So Rome conquered Greece, but it is suggested, and as has been said by many historians, that Greece conquered Rome because it's the culture of the Greeks in terms of art and literature and cuisine that in a sense corrupted Roman society and made them obsessed with too much dining, lots of pepper, expending huge fortunes on their stomach. Because before the Roman conquest of Greece, Rome was considered uncorrupted, having a simple diet, not interested in wealth, not interested in eating too much. And after their contact with Greece, they became more Hellenized, shall we say. So it's a complex issue. Yes, they embraced Greek culture completely and Greek cuisine. Roman fish sauce, of course, was Greek. It was not Roman. It started out as a Greek sauce.
And Renee, what would be the most unusual object in the exhibition that you recommend that our audience can't miss when they can come in?
The most unusual one, if I could go back to what Sally was saying about dormice, was the fact that they were cultivated and fattened in a ceramic container. And we have one of those in the exhibition, as well as one which surely was used for purifying and fattening and getting ready to eat snails. So we have a lot of things that you wouldn't expect to see in an exhibition about Pompeii. And in fact, this is the first time an exhibition will have this. And that is pots and pans. There's an absolutely beautiful sieve that was even signed by an artist. You know, even the things that were meant for the kitchen and things that were meant for dining and for serving were absolutely beautiful. They could be as practical and pragmatic as our pots and pans are. And yet there's a certain style that the Romans had that make them all so really very, very appealing. So people come into this section about the kitchen. They shouldn't be surprised to see things that they will recognize as objects that we use today.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And one last bit of question was, before we wrap up, is when can we expect to see the exhibition? So of course that's a little bit up in the air, but I think we're hoping to be later in December once we can ensure the objects can travel safely from Italy. So with that, I want to thank Renee and Sally for this wonderful program. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, thank you very much for the audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll consider making a tax-deductible donation at donate.famsf.org. Your gift helps serve art-loving individuals of all ages. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you back to DM starting next Tuesday, September 22nd through the 24th,
for member and donor preview days, where our Frida Kahlo exhibit eagerly awaits you. So please visit our website for ticketing details. The Legion of Honor is slated to open in mid-October, so stay tuned for that as well. Thank you so much.